You're up to date. It's 9:03.
Young British Asians Talk with Shruti Chauhan.
BBC Radio Leicester.
Hello and welcome to Young British Asians Talk here on BBC Radio Leicester with me, Shruti Chauhan. Tonight, as it is World Suicide Prevention Day, we are talking about suicide and attitudes towards suicide in the Asian community. Now, some of the things that we discuss tonight might be a bit disturbing for some listeners, and if this is the case, then it is totally understandable if you don't want to carry on listening, but we do want this hour to offer help and support. I am joined over Zoom by Humma, Jessica, Aze and Hannah. Good evening, guys.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Right, so go ahead and introduce yourselves. Let's start with Humma.
Yeah, hi, I'm Humma and I'm a senior mental health researcher based in London, and I'm really interested in the statistics on suicide and what that means in the South Asian community.
Good. And Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a survivor of suicide and I work with various organisations within mental health.
And Aze?
Hey everyone, I'm Aze. I'm a suicide survivor as well, a spoken word poet, and I'm a manager at Amazon.
And last but not least, Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I've had my own struggles with mental health, but more recently my father committed suicide two years ago.
Okay, now don't forget that if you are listening at home and you want to be part of this really important chat, you can drop us a line. You can text us on 81333 first word Leicester, or you can tweet us at BBC Leicester. Do get in touch. And also, if you are affected by the conversation today, check out the BBC's action line for health and support. All right, I will start with some stats. Every year, around 800,000 people die by suicide globally. That's one person every 40 seconds. So at the time it's taken me to say that sentence, someone else will have committed suicide. And it remains the most common cause of death for men aged 20 to 49 in the UK. And some experts also suggest that South Asian women are more likely to consider taking their lives than white women. And in the first half of 2020, so that's the first 2 quarters, more than 2,000 deaths have been registered as suicide in England. So with those stats, what do you guys make of those? Humma, do they surprise you?
Not really, because I anticipated that the COVID situation was going to cause a lot of exacerbation of people with existing mental health issues, and also people who don't have previous history of mental health issues. But the male statistics really doesn't surprise me because it's been an ongoing thing, and especially within the South Asian community, it's something that we don't really talk about. There seems to be a mismatch between kind of the stats that come out and how they actually reflect the South Asian community and the realities of being within the South Asian community.
And Humma, I was doing a bit of research, finding these stats, and I was looking on the ONS website. That's the Office for National Statistics. The data there, I found that suicides in the UK were divided into age, gender and region, but not ethnicity. Have you found that too in your findings?
There does seem to be a breakdown on other sites, like the Mental Health Foundation seems to break it down into BAME categories at least, but obviously there's a lot of difference even within that category. But breaking that down further, I know that South Asian women who are older are more likely to be at risk of trying to take their life, and also but actually the statistics show that that South Asian people are less likely to have suicidal ideation, so thoughts about committing suicide, which really surprises me because that's obviously a process towards getting towards taking your own life. So there seems to be that not being picked up earlier on in someone's situation, someone's decline in mental health, and getting to the place of
support.
going through with it or attempting to go through it. Yeah. So there seems to be a mismatch in that.
Right. We'll talk more about intervention a little later on. Before that, I want to talk about some of your personal stories. So, Aze, you do have a personal experience with suicide. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've attempted to take my own life a few times now, 4 times, and I'm only 23 years old at the moment. Obviously, you could probably tell by the sound of my voice that I'm a man as well. And like you say, men are the ones who struggle a lot with poor mental health and suicide, especially in this country. And I think what's interesting as well, there's a lot of layers to this conversation, but because not only am I coming through it with my own personal experiences of myself, but also, I've had friends who've tried to take their own life, and a friend of mine recently, a good friend of mine from university, Ben Brown, he committed suicide during lockdown. So completely agree with what Humma was saying with, COVID and self-isolation and quarantine that we find ourselves in. Us being by ourselves and with these demons and with these thoughts, it does stress the suicidal thoughts to a maximum, and it puts it to the forefront. And I think if something isn't done as soon as possible in terms of discussion, prevention, therapy, so many different factors and so many different influences that could help, then we're going to see a very, very dark future, not just for men, but, for everyone worldwide.
So are men less likely to seek help? Is that consistent with your own experience and your understanding generally?
Yeah, absolutely. From my own experience, coming from someone who was always sort of taught to, man up, never talk about your feelings. I mean, there's a reason why, women are like amazing with talking about their feelings. Obviously, there are those women who do struggle as well. Like, don't get me wrong, but I think in comparison to men, from what I've seen, it's I think there's a huge stigma, and obviously there's other factors to it. Like, I come from a South Asian background, Pakistani background. And figures do show from the NHS that a white person is 2 times more likely to seek help than a person of black or Asian ethnicity, which is a huge shame. There's so many different reasons as to why that is. Obviously, off the top of my head, I can just say that people in the Asian community find it taboo to talk about mental health, and obviously mental health is a spectrum that we all go through. But whether or not we're willing to talk about it, or afraid, be more open to talk about it instead of being afraid, there's a long way to go. But I'm glad that we can have a platform like this to speak about it so openly, because it is really important.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to the idea of taboo and stigma. Jessica, if you could share your story as well.
So just before my 16th birthday, I attempted suicide, and my reasons behind that was I experienced trauma. And it got to the point, it wasn't because I wanted to end my life, it was because the pain that I was feeling was unbearable. And although there might have been people around me, the pain was unbearable. So I thought, death was the only option. That was the only way that I could get rid of my pain, because there was no therapies available, there was no support. So that's the route I went down. But luckily enough, I ended up in hospital, and I ended up getting support after my suicide attempt.
Okay. This. Do you think are there people in the community that think that people who commit suicide, die by suicide, we'll talk a little bit about the terminology as well a little later, but people who die by suicide, that they are selfish? Have you ever heard that, Jessica?
Yeah, I have heard that, and there's a common myth about suicide that people who talk about suicide are not serious or won't do it. It's kind of classed as attention seeking. But speaking from my own experience, if somebody has got any suicidal thoughts, or they're not feeling themselves, I think you should take it seriously, whether you believe them or not. And it's essential that they try and get some help, or you offer to help them get support.
Okay, and if you're listening today and you are finding what we're talking about that it affects you, you can definitely access support at the BBC Action Line. You can go to BBC Action Line on the internet. And Hannah, finally, how about you?
So I think, as Ace was saying, there's kind of multiple layers, I think, to my story too. Most recently, my dad committed suicide 2 years ago, and he was a kind of 52-year-old Pakistani heritage man. So I think fits into that category of statistics we were discussing earlier. But I, equally have had struggles with mental health. I attempted to take my own life when I was 17, and I think. As they said, I think there's lots of people who potentially aren't counted in statistics because they have suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, and it can be seen that talking about that is almost justifying it or attention seeking. And I think there probably are a lot more people who have suicidal thoughts and feelings that don't necessarily voice them, or that we don't kind of count in our figures and statistics, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're about to commit suicide. In some cases it may be, but in some cases people might have those thoughts or feelings for a really long time.
So could you can you pinpoint why you were feeling like that? What drove you to feel like that?
I think for me, similar to what Jessica was saying, it wasn't necessarily that I wanted my life to end, for example, but almost that I didn't want to have to talk about my feelings. I think, kind of, like I said, I struggle with mental health, and when I was quite young, I started self-harming, and that's something I've struggled with through my life. And actually, I felt that if I tried to take my own life, I just wouldn't have to have those conversations. I wouldn't have to talk about it, and that would be almost an easy way out. And obviously that's not the case.
Why is it that we find it so difficult to talk about it in within the South Asian community specifically, apart from the obvious? But do you think there are things that make it that little bit more difficult, being of South Asian heritage, Ace?
Yeah, I completely believe so. I think it's a big part in saying that it's intergenerational trauma. So I feel as though it just being a constant cycle of bottling it up and never really speaking about it, especially of, like coming from, being a second generation immigrant myself here in London, like I see the breakdown of miscommunication or lack of communication, like completely from my parents and their extended family and whatnot. I just feel as though they discount other people's feelings, or they feel as though, because they had completely different problems to us, like our generation. And we need to start looking at suicide as, a cry for help. Like you said, we've had people on this discussion here who well, obviously, like, suicide isn't in seeking attention. It can also be just like you're in huge pain and you want it to end. So I feel as though there's a huge misunderstanding of what suicide is and why people go through it. And I just feel as though, South Asian parents or, Black parents, any parent who's going through this, or they have a child who they feel as though could be at risk, just please listen and be a good listener, because there could be so many ways that you could prevent this. And obviously we'll talk about prevention a little bit later, but yeah, it's a huge problem that I feel as though can be overcome in our community. We just need to be extra vigilant.
And I think what you said about a cry for help is such a relevant point. I think a lot of the time people are kind of told that it might be, you're seeking attention, or that's how people feel, but I don't think that that's such a bad thing. I think if somebody is looking for attention, like you said, it's because they're asking for help. It's because they're looking for help and they don't know how to verbalise it. And I don't think that seeking attention should be kind of a negative way of looking at it. I think it's good sometimes that people are looking for that attention to their situation.
Exactly, Hannah. I completely agree.
If you were just tuning in, you were listening to Young British Asians Talk here on BBC Radio Leicester with me, Shruti Chauhan. We are talking about suicide. Hannah, you talked about verbalising what your feelings are. Do you think that we don't have the vocabulary necessarily to talk about mental health? Humma, I think you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I mean, I used to be of the view of like we don't talk about it, and so the language doesn't exist. But I've like discussed this with quite a few people, and also seen some kind of third sector organisations in the South Asia community actually point out that the language does exist, we just don't use it, and especially I think within our generation, the languages that we learn are often just through speaking and not through looking through a dictionary or learning the language like we learn French and German in school. So the language does exist, we just don't know it or we don't use it, and because it's such a stigma within the community, as it passes through generations, that language gets lost, and especially with the history of South Asia and colonialism, a lot of it has been wiped out anyway because of the way the British kind of colonized India, and then partition happened, and so there is language there. It's just that we don't use it, and we haven't made the effort to go out and research the language and look at the actual official dictionaries that existed and exist. We just have to make that effort to do it, and I think it falls upon us as a generation to take that on us, especially as our parents and grandparents were the immigrants who moved to a completely different country and had to change their entire lifestyles, and there's kind of been a switch in life and switch in the way we live life and the way we talk about things, and it's a lot for our parents. I mean, it doesn't take away from everything that everyone's going through and people who are having suicidal ideation, but there has to be a change now for this generation and future generation. And I just really wanted to point out what Aze was saying earlier about intergenerational trauma, because actually the research shows that the trauma that our parents and grandparents experienced in partition had a huge effect on the way we express stress, even to the point of our epigenetics. So that's then passed down through to us and will be passed down to future generations as well. So I feel like we have a duty to make that change and talk about it now, so that in the future we're not struggling like people are today, and we are able to verbalize our struggles.
So how do you know at all, in terms of epigenetics, how does that stress manifest down progressively in generations?
So epigenetics changes the way your genes express specific, so for example, the stress gene, if you've been through intergenerational trauma, you might be more likely to be stressed in situations where people who don't experience trauma wouldn't be as stressed or stressed at all. So because we internalize a lot of things, it means that over time your genetics change to accommodate what you've been through, and so that's passed down into generations. It's kind of like the fight or flight mode, where something happens and you're not actually in a tense situation, but because your genetics expressing that gene, it means that you're becoming increasingly stressed or taking something a different way after someone who won't have had that intergenerational trauma.
I just want to go back to what you were saying about language and how we don't have the language. Interestingly, I did a poll on Instagram earlier on, and I asked, is there a word for depression in any South Asian languages? To which 78% of people who voted said no, there isn't, and 22% of people said yes. I then asked, does anyone know some of these words? And some suggestions were put forward. And there are some very plausible, very legitimate suggestions. So I think what I get from that is that in colloquial language, which is the language that we are speaking every day, so not the language that we pick up from books, as you said, Humma, we don't have that word. We're not using that word. It's not in circulation. Is this consistent with what you found in when you've spoken to your parents, Jessica, about mental health, depression?
I think the common word that I've come across in Asian communities is pagal, which, if you translate it, means crazy. Now, if you call someone pagal, that's discrimination. It doesn't mean you're crazy. And I think, there is a language barrier. We don't have the language to express what we're feeling And this is going back generations. So, you know, if our parents or our grandparents or our aunties or uncle were feeling, you know, they've got some symptoms, it might be hard for them to express it. And then there's also the fact with the stigma. So if you were to use a word like bagel, what implications is that going to have on you and your family? Because we all know Indian families and Asian families are all about honor and pride and how you're going to be perceived in front of others. So the stigma carries, you know, is such a big thing within our community.
I actually really agree with that because, like, you know, if someone's just seen as having mild symptoms of mental health issues or just being a bit quiet, or, you know, even if they're acting erratic, and using the term bargal is so, like, it's so discriminating and it's just so dehumanizing. Like, I have an aunt in Pakistan who, you know, she's clearly got mental health problems, but she's not an inhumane person. She's really nice if you get to know her, but the language has always been used of like, oh, she's bargal, and like, as a young person, it was like, don't go near her when you go to Pakistan, don't, you know, communicate with her. But as I've gotten older, I feel really bad about it now because she's a nice person if you communicate with her. She just has mental health problems like a lot of people. I have had mental health problems, and like, and you know, like, it's just not what people make it out to be, and then it carries on through telling someone that they're just bargal, and then people assume that they're gonna, like, you know, try and kill you if you go near them or something, and it's not that.
Hannah, sorry, carry on, Humma. Sorry, carry on.
I'm just saying that then passes on through other people, and then within the community, and then it just becomes this big cloud of like mental health, being bargal, like your whole life is over, don't let them bring up their kids, like it affects your marriage potentials, it affects your job prospects, and all of these things are massive in our community. Like, they're literally the things that make you or break you. If you don't have good marriage prospects, then what are you going to do with your life? And it's just, all these things are just carrying on.
Hannah,
it's just dangerous.
Sorry, Humma. I wanted to ask Hannah, what was the language used around your dad's suicide?
So I think, I guess, kind of when after the immediate kind of funeral and when we were kind of congregating and mourning as a family, actually nobody mentioned anything. Nobody used the word suicide. I think I kind of mentioned it to one of my kind of elder family members, and they weren't aware that it was a suicide. They hadn't been told. They, you know, just told that, you know, it was a heart attack or just, you know, natural causes. And I was really shocked because I think, you know, I've always been kind of completely open and honest about it, and I think probably I've got family members that don't know it was a suicide, and it was kind of almost not hushed up, but just not spoken about, not discussed. And similarly not kind of discussed afterwards. I think, you know, everybody grieved, but I think, you know, nobody really talked about it in the terms that we're talking about it now.
And how damaging do you think that is?
I think it's just, it makes it really difficult to almost progress. I don't ever feel like anybody should be kind of trying to find blame or trying to necessarily find reasons for these things, but I think even when people have in the family kind of addressed it as suicide, it's kind of still just been, well, you know, it was an awful thing. He must have been struggling, and no one's discussed what he might have been struggling with, or the pressures, or any of those things that we've been discussing that might have led him to felt that way. It's always just kind of been like, well, that's a real, you know, it's a tragedy, but it's an isolated incident. You know, there was nothing, you know, there were no signs, there was nothing, and it was a shock to the family. You know, we weren't aware of any mental health struggles he was having or any problems, but I think that kind of almost just assuming it's a isolated incident, it means that we're not looking for ways that we can prevent it and help other members of the family or our friends or the community, because if we're not looking into what those causes could have been and what problems could have sat behind somebody's mind and reasons to do that, it means that we can't really move on and help other people.
Did you ever, as a family, get to the bottom of the why?
I don't think so. I think I probably more than anyone wanted to dissect all the reasons why. And I think you can never truly know what was in somebody's mind, but I don't think kind of I don't think the family were up for doing it as much digging about why. I think people just wanted to feel like they could just accept it and move on, and that discussing all of that was almost bringing up things that happened in the past, or you know, bringing up childhood trauma, and actually that wasn't something that people wanted to talk about.
Yeah, it's the silence, isn't it? It's honestly, secrets can kill, and I feel as though like I'm completely on the same wavelength as all of these like incredible people that we got here, Jessica, Hannah, Humma, even you, Shruti. Like even you know, saying things like Fargo, calling someone crazy, like I've had that, but then also it's the silence and the lack of at least when you're calling someone Fargo, you're actually acknowledging something, you know. But people not, or family members not even wanting to talk about it or discuss it, like that hurts. It's really painful.
So Ace, when you attempted suicide after that, did you talk to your parents about what happened, and how did that conversation go?
It's an interesting question. It's really weird because, like I told you guys before, I've never really been open about speaking about my own feelings for a range of reasons. So number one, I've had a fair few friends who've died. A lot of my friends have been murdered, raped, obviously committed suicide, died of natural causes. And obviously that builds up the trauma, and obviously my own mental health through whether it's been like studies or external or internal factors. And on my 21st birthday, after I think it was my fourth failed suicide attempt, obviously that was the day that I wanted to end it all. So I wrote this sort of goodbye note that ended up being a poem, and I thought I would just record me reciting it or saying it and then post it online. But then managed to wake up the next day, and obviously I saw it got a lot of coverage, and that's how my family found out about what I was going through. But even then, they found it really hard to talk to me about it, because obviously I was at university, but then when I came back, it was still really hard to talk to me about it. And I thought maybe, that last straw would have given them the chance to engage in a dialogue with me. But even then, it was pretty difficult. Over the years, it's gotten a little bit better. However, there's still a huge misunderstanding, and I feel as though they just want to brush it under the carpet, shrug it under the rug, and move on, obviously, like Hannah said. But I feel as though when you're shying away and you want to move on, that's not addressing the issue, and that's never going to solve the problem or come towards a solution, or a range of solutions, at least.
You are listening to Young British Asians Talk here on BBC Radio Leicester with me, Shruti Chauhan. It's just gone 9:30.
The sound of Leicester.
Weekday mornings from 6.
Breakfast with Jimmy Carpenter.
Well, despite the reopening of gyms, it seems some of us prefer getting sweaty from our living room. Meet Pamela from Hinckley.
Thinking that there's going to be a few people turning up in their living room to work out with me, and now we've got over 500 members, which is just amazing.
Care Leaver Casey told us about the importance of foster families.
It's such a rewarding thing. We are not a group of naughty Tracy beakers. We are human beings at the end of the day.
And Leicestershire hero Arif on how he's helping the homeless.
Managed to win 14 pairs of jeans off a lady in Tamworth. She then met me at Hinckley Island to give me the jeans after explaining what they were for, and that's it. It started from there.
Back with you tomorrow from 6.
Jimmy Carpenter at breakfast.
BBC Radio Leicester.
Young British Asians Talk with Shruti Chauhan.
BBC Radio Leicester.
Yes, I'm here until 10 with my guests Humma, Jessica, Aze and Hannah. We are talking about suicide. Aze, you were talking about how difficult the conversation was with your parents that you had when you told them that you had attempted to take your life. Jessica, was yours a similar difficult conversation? Ooh, I think you're on mute, Jessica.
I ended up in hospital, and my family were called in because I was under the age of 18. And it was a difficult conversation, because when you're not comfortable speaking with somebody and then you're going to have to explain why you've gone down that route, it was a really difficult conversation. And touching on what A said and Humma said, it's like the shame, secrets and stigma keep people from hiding their struggles. And then that shame and inability to tell people the truth, whether it's your friends, your family members, and importantly to yourself, it can also build up like a denial within yourself, because sometimes in order for you to recover, you've got to accept what you're going through. And sometimes when people are going through something in life, you can be in denial of what's actually happened to you. But I think like even like my uncle passed away from suicide, and there was no signs or conversation that took place with my family members or any indication given about, you know, what he was feeling. And it just goes to show you, it's just one of those things that if we're not talking about it and we're not able to have those open and safe conversations, we really don't know what's going on with people's lives. And, you know, the effects of losing him to suicide and having those unanswered questions, like Hannah was saying, it doesn't give you closure. Like, you know, people in the family might be saying, you know, it was this, it was that, this happened. But, you know, the truth is the person was struggling and they felt that was the option that they could take.
And how was it perceived by people in the wider South Asian community, or was it kept quiet?
With myself, it was kept quiet. Personally, I didn't want to discuss it with anybody else. And then it also my family members, like, I don't blame them. Like, when you're in the Asian community, it's difficult to talk openly about, you know, taboo subjects such as mental health. So I would not have expected them, you know, to go out to your extended family and say, look, this is what's going on. But within my own family home, like with my mum, I did discuss it with her, and she did take me to like therapy to try and get support and things like that. But I think even then it was a taboo subject. Is if you're not comfortable in speaking about what you're going through, then you're not able to open up. And especially as a child, you don't have the language to express what your feelings are. You're confused, and you might not, like what we spoke about, you might not have the language to express it. It's very difficult.
So it's really promising that your mum obviously took you to therapy. Ace, did your parents do anything similar?
No, I wish they did. I think it went down to me to seek professional help. Obviously, that was a long road and a battle to actually accept that I needed the help.
So with that conversation, you had that conversation with your parents. How did that conversation end?
Again, it ended up in silence, or just moving on, or just failing to acknowledge it, which is, if I ever have kids, hopefully if I have kids, something I never want to do for them. It's breaking that cycle. And I feel as though the outlet I had, it wasn't even with my parents or family or my close friends as it should have been. It was with poetry, which is something like an art form that I hated growing up, but more often than not, it ended up being the natural outlet that I needed to express myself and just find a voice that I never thought I had.
Tell us a little bit about how poetry helped you, alongside therapy, of course. I don't know if you know, Ace, but I'm also a poet.
Yeah, you are. You have an amazing poetry. Guys, if you haven't already, check out.
Tell us how poetry helped you.
No, I appreciate that. And it's good meeting other fellow poets. I think poetry helped me in a massive way to just write down my feelings. There is a huge catharsis in just trying to get whatever's going on in your head down onto a page, or even if it's writing on your notes in your phone. It is extremely therapeutic, but then it's also therapy. It's a really interesting discussion into the exploration of whether poetry is therapy or therapeutic. I believe it can be both, because obviously not a lot of people can actually afford therapy. I was using my student loan to pay for my counselling sessions while I was at university. But then again, when you leave university, or if you leave school or whatever, you don't have that money, you could struggle. So you could, end up doing harm to yourself, but you need to find the outlets. You need to find people that can support you. And again, if you're in a really unprivileged position of not having people around you, you need to find ways that can help you. So I would hugely recommend writing, not necessarily performing. You don't have to perform, but then again, spoken word poetry, there's an added layer of an element of catharsis and expression, and like hearing yourself say the words. It's a whole other sense of freedom that you can have. So I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, I want to go back to stats again. The mentalhealth.org.uk said that whilst the white population experienced the highest rates for suicidal thoughts, suicidal rates are higher in certain sections of the black community and South Asian women than among their white British counterparts. Humma, what do you think about that?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it raises a lot of questions for me as to why suicide ideation isn't being picked up in they're populations who are at risk of committing suicide or are, that are taking their own lives or attempting to take their own lives. So, like, for me, it's like people are clearly not presenting in services or receiving the right support. And I'm also questioning how they're collecting that data on how, suicide ideation, what does that mean? Like, what scales are they using? Are they going out into the community to, to where people actually are or where they are likely to congregate, so in places of faith or in local community centres, or are they only collecting it when people are presenting in services like in CAMS or AMS and in mental health services or in hospital, which is obviously, not a very good representation of the community because, the statistics already show that BAME people, but obviously within that South Asian people, are less likely to seek support until they are at the final straw, and or if they've gone through with that, with trying to take their own life. So for me, it's a mismatch in whether services are addressing the needs of the South Asian community and how culturally appropriate the services are for the South Asian community. And that's multifaceted anyway, but the stats don't really shock. They do shock me, but I'm wondering why it's not being picked up, and how the data is being collected, and also what questions are being asked to kind of collect to kind of what equals suicide ideation, because there's a wide spectrum of that. So that raises quite a lot of questions for me, and for me, when I'm thinking about statistics in the AME communities anyway, I'm thinking about the methodologies that are used in the language, because obviously language that is used might not apply to, older South Asian women might be women who have immigrated and, don't have the language to express that they're having suicidal thoughts. So, they're more at risk, but they're not expressing that they're having the thoughts because, they just see it as their everyday life. And, in a world where patriarchy affects everyone, it affects men, and men are also, disadvantaged by the patriarchal system. It obviously also is dangerous to women because within our communities, a lot of women are, are raised and then married off, and they don't have the chance to ever express themselves except for when they're mothers, and that's through raising their children. So there's just so many things going around in my head, but yeah, I can be here forever talking about it.
I completely agree with that. Just a quick one as well. Like, it affects hugely. The patriarchy is so detrimental to a lot of this, because if you think about suicide, it's linked to so many different factors. Patriarchy, racism, sexual violence. There's so many factors and layers to this. It's so complex, but breaking it down really, really helps. And like I said before, I've had friends who've committed suicide, and they've been both male and female. One of my friends, when I was a recruitment consultant in a previous job, one of my candidates, a good friend of mine now, his daughter Caitlin, she committed suicide, and she was really young, teenager, and she was a young white girl. So I feel as though there's so many different factors in it, even social media, which we haven't even spoken about as well. There's so many things affecting this generation. It's a huge generational issue, I believe, as well, because it's only going to get worse and worse. So I feel as though if we're not actually showing up for each other, which is often the hardest thing, but it's also often the easiest thing to do, just the little things, just to help each other and hold space. It's so key, it's so vital.
Hannah, what?
Can I just add something?
Go on.
I was going to add as well, about the system that we kind of live in, is that because the statistics around men is really, really important to think about, breaking it down as well, because we live in a system where men are, the rational beings, and women are supposed to be the emotional beings, and so men lose out because they're not supposed to be emotional. When they are being emotional, they're told to grow up and be a man, or men don't cry, and then women lose out because if they are rational, or if they're less emotional, they're seen as trying to take on men, and this whole system is just so damaging. And the fact that men aren't feeling able enough to express their emotional side is resulting in these horrible statistics. So we just really need to consider the political system that we're in, and the capitalist system and the patriarchal system that is just causing all these damages down to the core of people losing their lives over it.
I think there is like a lot of racial disparities within mental health services, and also you have to bear in mind that a lot of people in the BAME communities don't engage with mental health services due to stigma. So sometimes the data is not reflective of what's actually going on. And if someone's going down the route of accessing the crisis team, it's when they're at their lowest. If someone was to access services when they started, initially first get their symptoms, maybe they wouldn't go to the extreme of being suicidal if there was like therapeutic interventions.
How do you think that intervention could be better done then? Do you think there needs to be more outreach? Do you think that places of worship have a place have a part to play in this, Jessica?
So there's a couple of factors. So talking about mental health services, there's issues around funding, which we're all aware of. There's issues around engagement. If somebody is feeling a certain type of way and they've got that stigma within the community, like for example, when I was going through my own trauma and I was experiencing mental health symptoms, and I was having appointments with the doctors and trying to explain what was going on, even though I work in services, I still had that stigma and that fear that if I disclosed that I was feeling suicidal, would I then, would then my kids be taken off me? Would I then be sectioned because the language or the understanding is not very clear and people are quick to make judgments? So there's always that fear and the stigma there. But then, if you're talking about religion, there is also that aspect where certain people think if you've got a mental health symptom, it's a spiritual thing, or like, for example, you might have a jinn in you, and there's conversations like that. So, it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly what it could be, because there's so with BAME communities, you've got the religion, you've got the community, you've got the cultural differences. So it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly. Suicide, is such a complex situation and such a complex thing that there's so many issues. There's societal, there's cultural things that could go wrong, or that traumas can be. You could be going through traumas, so it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly what it could be.
I think it needs to be a mix of like several things, because I think often we're like, there's a one answer, but there isn't. Like, we need to collaborate and bring several things into it, because some populations of the BAME community might be engaging in faith centres, but others won't. And so it needs to be a collective effort of, making sure we're touching on everything. And I do think places of worship have a role to play in it, because within religion, even within Islam, like the biggest sin is committing suicide. And so like that kind of language, it just automatically pushes people away. Whereas if we just humanize that this is a real thing, and we have people going outreach into places of worship, so like in mosques where people are coming to learn the Quran or whatever, and they kind of make this a real thing of mental health is real, like this is what happens when you're struggling, or this might be symptoms that you might be experiencing. It just makes it a lot more real, and also it shows that your faith isn't exclusive to how you're feeling with your mental health. It doesn't mean that if you're having struggles with your mental health, there's something wrong with your faith or in your belief in God. There's not a mismatch there. And then that kind of breaks down the barriers of, not wanting to talk about having suicidal ideation because your parents might think you're not, conforming to the ideals of your religion. And so there's that danger as well. And a lot of people within the Muslim community are in fear of talking about suicide, because it's seen as the worst crime you could ever do. Yeah. And it's not a crime. It's not like, even the way we talk about it, like we're obviously going to talk about language, but even saying you're committing a crime, committing suicide, it associates it with committing a crime. So there needs to be that change in language as well, of taking your own life or killing yourself or dying, things like that. Like, there's all these small nuances that need to be flipped and reversed, so there's a collective effort to make things better.
I honestly believe that if at a young age you're taught about grounding techniques, emotional resilience, if you're going through something, then you can use those techniques to kind of manage your symptoms. In this, like when I was at school, there was no any grounding techniques talk. We didn't really talk about emotional resilience, and like even with like therapy, if you go through accessing services, like if you went through, for example, the NHS, a lot of times you're going to be medicated and then you're going to be on a wait list to get therapy. Yeah. And the timescales from initially getting that medication and getting therapy could be anything between 6 months to 3 years, depending on what service you can access. Now, if somebody is waiting, if somebody is in a crisis point at the time to go see their GP and they've been prescribed medication and they need therapy to, try to manage the symptoms, what's going to happen to them within the 6 to 3 years or whatever timescale they're waiting is going to exacerbate their symptoms. And it's very difficult because it's a funding issue within services, but also, some things like counselling, it could be limited. You might get 12 weeks, you might get 6 months, you might get a year. It's not consistent. Like someone might need 2 years worth of counselling. And then it also depends, like if somebody is diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, and suicidal ideations could be a symptom of, like, for example, I've got bipolar, and one of the symptoms could be that you get suicidal thoughts. Now, if you're not able to manage those symptoms, then you may act upon those thoughts.
Hannah, do you think that doctors are too quick to hand out medication where depression is concerned?
I think a lot of the time they can be, and from my personal experience of kind of going to doctors or GPs over the years to kind of talk about the way I'm feeling and ask them for help, a lot of the time I kind of on several occasions I've kind of been asked, like, what do you want? What have you come for? Do you want medication? Do you want therapy? Kind of, they almost assume you've come with an agenda, and it's almost a choice. You can take the medication or you can't. And I think
a quick fix.
And I think kind of as a general public person, I'm personally not that educated on all the pros and cons and all the right ways to take it. And I think on the occasion I was prescribed medication, kind of in the end I decided not to take it. And on other occasions I've been referred to therapy or counselling, but again kind of on a long wait list, or I've had the privilege before to be referred through work to have kind of private counselling through my job, but you kind of get 4 sessions and they say, what do you want to talk about? And you kind of like, well, I don't have one specific issue I want to talk about, and then you almost kind of like through and out the other side. I think it's a lot of quick fixes, whether it's medication or whether it's the talking therapy. A lot of the time it's not long-term management. I think a lot of the time the professional services are looking for an issue to fix, and there isn't always an issue to fix. And I think for me, kind of having struggled with my own mental health and then having recently lost my father to suicide, I think a lot of the time when I've tried to kind of access professional help, everyone's just wanted to fix the grief problem, which obviously is an issue for me, but that's not the only thing going on in my life. And actually I feel like I've managed my grief, but that doesn't mean I now don't have any struggles with mental health.
Do you think then that reform needs to be first and foremost in healthcare?
I think there needs to be a holistic approach around. I think the healthcare is a really important part, and we need reform, we need more funding. But I personally feel like there needs to be more from everywhere, from every direction. In your place at work, for example, we spend so much time at work, and I don't think there are enough people trained on mental health first aid, or even things like my husband's done a mental health first aider course recently, and it's got loads of information about like creating a crisis plan and discussing, say, with your team or with your manager at work or people that you spend a lot of time with, actually, when these things, when I show these things, that could mean I'm struggling. So it could be, I don't know, normally every day I put lipstick on, and actually if I get up every day and I don't put lipstick on, for me, I'm having a bad morning, or whatever it is that's personal to you, and making sure that we kind of have those things in place if it's in your place of work or with your family and friends, and not just putting the responsibility on everybody asking their friends if they're all right, but responsibility on employers and managers and places of work to be having those kind of awareness and action plans and conversations so that people can help when help is needed.
Ace, do you think that social media needs to take more responsibility? Of course, we've very recently, there was a Facebook Live suicide that was live streamed, and then and it was widely shared on TikTok, and TikTok scrambled to remove that from its site, and its algorithms of course pushed it up so it was even trending. Do you think that social media needs to take more responsibility, Ace?
Absolutely, and it wasn't even just the TikTok incident. I've seen it over the last decade in the rise of social media. This has happened before, even with YouTube. There's been a couple of YouTubers who've shown it, a couple of YouTubers have even taken their own life. Like, I think taking responsibility can come in many forms. Obviously, this is a huge conversation to have, but I feel it's a really good way to facilitate that conversation would just be social media platforms coming together, putting their hands up and trying to engage with their audiences and trying to maybe hold conferences or just talk it out with the people that are actually using it. Because obviously social media apps, their main aim is to get as much attention from you as possible. So if you're hooked onto something that's completely damaging and could be triggering to so many people who've gone through suicide or gone through poor mental health, obviously mental health is a huge spectrum, so it affects everyone. I feel as though a lot more needs to be done on their end, and I feel as though it goes back to like basically every single point that everyone here has made. It needs to be a whole holistic approach, and we all need to come together on this collectively.
Jess, I know that you've got children as well. How do you think that we should be talking to children about mental health and suicide? At what age?
I think as young as possible. It's just about checking in with people, having those open conversations. It's just asking simple things like, how are you? And, you know, if
and how
like,
are you really? And say like, how are you really? Not just how are you?
Ask it twice. And, you know, touching on like social media, like I believe that our society and community needs to have effective mental health support and treatment when needed. Like early intervention can help from people for symptoms getting worse. And then having strong supportive relationships, social connections such as positive relationships, whether it's with your colleagues, family, friends, or a partner, is ideal. And then, you know, the school can also play an important part in providing support networks for children. But I think you, as a person, you have that individual responsibility, and, you know, you have to do whatever you can to make yourself feel better. It's all well and good accessing service, but if you're not engaging in it, then you're not helping yourself. And then it's all about, you know, learning techniques such as self-care, self-love, grounding techniques to help you cope when you're going through like a traumatic time. And then even like each of us, like just paying attention to the well-being of people in our communities, such as friends, family, colleagues. And if you're worried about someone, have those conversations. You know, don't be judgmental and be, you know, sometimes people just want to kind of vent or kind of explain what they're going through. They may not be looking for advice. So it's just about having those open conversations and having a safe space to talk.
Okay, so
I think the one thing that we missed out of this conversation is the fact that, you know, having suicidal ideation is and you know, being on that path is really isolating and lonely, and we haven't talked about the power of peer support in this, and in the research that I do, I evaluate quite a lot of peer support, and something that always comes up is just being around people who have similar experiences. And you don't have to disclose your experiences, but just knowing that they've been through something similar and that you can sit there and be in a safe space around other people who have similar experiences, and, you know, that they'll understand you when you're talking. They don't have to tell you what they've been through, but there's just that mutual kind of trust and safe space to express yourself however you wish. Because we talked a lot about how isolating services are and family and things like this, but, you know, and services, but there's so many local community organizations that are doing this work with minimal funding and amazingly, like, they're using all the resources, and a lot of volunteers are facilitating these peer support groups that people really benefit from. It's not for everyone, but it can be hugely beneficial to a lot of people.
All right.
I think peer support is great, because sometimes when you're going through symptoms, you might feel like you're the only one, and then that peer support can, if you attend a peer support group, you kind of feel like, you know, there are other people who are experiencing similar symptoms or going through similar situations as you, and you kind of feel like you're not alone.
And a lot of people have had really bad experiences with services, and they don't want to go back into it. You know, they want something local that's going to help and just keep things, you know, not because a lot of people go into services and it makes things worse because of the microaggressions that you face within services that have been created by white male academics, and services that are being created by white male academics. And all the research is being done by white male academics who don't understand the experiences of you know, the BAME community. So when you're in a space that's run by volunteers in the local area, who know your community, who know your experiences and probably have lived experience themselves as well. There's so much power in that.
Okay, sorry, Jessica, go on really quickly.
I think I think anybody that's going through it and any type of symptoms or feeling down or low, it's important that you get support for yourself. Whether it's reaching out to your friends, whether it's reaching out to your family or services. And if you know anybody in your family or in your network, take a minute to notice what's going on with them. Take a minute to reach out and start a conversation if you know something is different. Take a minute to find out what help is available locally. There's loads of information that you can get on the internet. And it's just about asking people how they are and then asking it twice.
It doesn't take very long, guys. Honestly, it would go a long way. You can end up saving a life.
All right, thank you so much, guys. That is actually all we've got time for. Thank you, Humma, Jessica, Aze, and Hannah for joining us today. The bottom line is, it's really, really important that you talk to somebody. If you're struggling with any of the things that we have talked about tonight, please, please, please make sure that you do. If you are affected by any of the issues that we covered in the programme today, and you'd like more information, you can check out the BBC's Action Line at bbc.co.uk/action line. Click on mental health and there'll be a list of organisations which offer support. Alternatively, you can call 08000 155 998. That's 08000 155 998. Lines are open 24 hours a day and calls are absolutely free. And of course, you can also call the Samaritans for free 24 hours a day on 116 123 116 123. I am Shruti Chauhan and I will be back at the same time next week with more Young British Asians Talk. Good night. And don't forget...
On the BBC Sounds app, on your smart speaker,
Play BBC Radio Leicester.
and on your radio.
The sound of Leicester is
BBC Radio Leicester.
At 10, I'm Moira Alderson with your BBC News update. The number of people waiting...